to thank Darren Linville for joining me from Clemson University in South Carolina. Hey, Darren, can you hear me? Are you down there?
Yeah, I am down here. Thanks for having me, Andy.
Darren, I'm getting a little bit of feedback from you, so give me a hey now 1 2 1 2.
Hey now 1 2 1 2.
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you for having me. I also want to welcome Ginger Park tonight. Ginger will be the TA. She's in the chat box and one of our current Teacher Advisory Council members, and she's going to be responding to questions and adding resources. So I'd invite everyone to talk to her. But Darren, before we get started, I'm going to turn the reins of the PowerPoint over to you. I'm actually going to launch a survey. So if you'll be patient with me, I'm going to ask our audience a poll, and we're going to all see the results live. And then I'd like your impressions of what you see. And this poll question is one that you and I have talked about. It is select the social media app that you use at least 3 times a week. You may select more than one. So I'm going to send that survey now. And Darren, if you'll give this about 45 seconds to respond, you should be able to see this pop up on your screen. Okay, it's starting to come in. Darren, can you see that as well?
Is it under the Surveys tab?
Yeah, go over to the Surveys tab. I think you can see it. And then in a moment, I'll launch it to the audience in just a moment. So this is a cumulative number. We're asking which of all of these do they use at least 3 times a week. Of course, there's no judgment intended whatsoever. So we're not going to roll our eyes and at somebody who's on TikTok more than three days a week. Let's see what the numbers bear out. You know, it's funny, as I looked at tonight's title, Darren, the word of the 4 that really struck me as a framing for what I think we'll talk about is the word social. We can carry around connections with all the people we care about and some we don't in our pockets all the time, 24 hours a day. When I was in high school, if I could have pulled the phone farther from the wall to talk on the phone in the closet, I would have done it. But to give access to all these people at once seems to be sort of the secret ingredient of what you might be sharing, that social piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to appreciate the effects. I think that bias is also important.
Yes.
And I was just thinking, as I was reflecting on my visual aid, that the original version had a tiger paw in it. And I can't help but think that maybe up there in Chapel Hill, your own bias may be reflected in the fact that the slide is now missing the tiger paw that was there.
I don't think we took it out on purpose. All right, I'm ending the survey. I'm going to send the results to the audience. You should still be able to see them in your survey tab. So I just shared them. Professor, tell us what you see.
It looks fairly consistent, actually, with national averages. Most Americans are on Facebook, and that's what we see here, with almost 65% of people in this group are on Facebook. Instagram is a close second, owned by Facebook. In my informal opinion, those two together are in many ways the worst in terms of spreading disinformation, and they're black box. They are loath to work with outsiders, so it's really hard to tell what's going on those platforms. And then everything else is much, much lower, with Twitter a little bit of a standout there, with about a quarter of everybody on Twitter, which again is pretty typical of national standards. I think worldwide a little bit, Twitter does capture a little bit more than a quarter of most social media users, but that's not far outside of the bounds of what I would have expected.
And do you see this breakdown at all by age group? Again, we've got professional educators here tonight, so likely, we're all within a rough bandwidth. But how do you see the age factor playing into numbers like this on a national average?
Oh yeah, sure. Older Americans are more likely to be on Facebook, clearly, and younger Americans are steering more and more away from Facebook all the time.
Yeah.
That's fundamentally why Facebook bought Instagram, in a lot of people's opinions, because Instagram was capturing a lot of that younger demographic. And obviously, again, younger folks are on TikTok, which is perhaps why President Trump feels he's got the bandwidth to shut it down, because those younger Americans that are on TikTok are less likely to vote.
Right. Correct. Thank you. Well, if you toggle back to the slides tab, you'll be able to now lead us through your talk. And again, what I'll do is queue up the questions and bring them to you when the time is right. But we are deeply interested in this topic for a variety of reasons, but this seems to be very present tense and very real life. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I guess I should pause real quick and point out the one that we neglected to put on there, though it's obvious in hindsight that folks are talking about on the chat, is YouTube. But in a lot of ways, YouTube is sort of the Uber social media. A lot of people almost don't think of it as a social media, even though it fundamentally is. And all of these other platforms connect through and use social media. And a lot of the accounts that I'm going to be talking about this evening, the disinformation accounts that I'll be talking about this evening, utilized YouTube, if only indirectly. And disinformation campaigns continue to use YouTube today. So first, I want to quickly define a couple of important terms before we dive in this evening, and that is the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. They're often used interchangeably, but they are distinct. Misinformation is information that is just incorrect. Misinformation can be spread for a lot of reasons, and it's not purposeful in its spread necessarily. So a lot of folks believe that, for instance, COVID-19 is caused by 5G towers. Some people passionately believe that to be the case. Science would disagree with them, as I hope you know. But the spread of that sort of information is often spread as misinformation. Disinformation is a subset of misinformation. It's misinformation that is purposefully spread. It is spread with the intent to deceive, and it is often done by nation states like China, Iran, and as you likely well know, Russia is famous from the Mueller report. But increasingly, disinformation is engaged in by domestic actors as well, right here at home. Here at Clemson, my colleague Patrick Warren and I have really worked through the past several years to understand disinformation, and specifically how it is spread across social media. Disinformation is spread in a lot of ways. If you look just at Russia, and that's our particular expertise and what I'm going to be speaking about mostly this evening, they have a lot of venues through which they spread disinformation. Probably most importantly, they have RT and Sputnik, their mainstream state news outlets. Those are organizations that have budgets in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and we can get on any major cable provider. You can find RT. RT is one of the speaking of YouTube, RT is one of the biggest accounts, or more than almost any other news agency. RT is watched on YouTube, so it's got a significant influence. And despite that, we tend to forget about that in terms of disinformation. Like a lot of news, though, a lot of what is on RT and Sputnik is true, but they slide in disinformation subtly. They give things spin and try to tell you how to think about particular messages and particular stories. But what we've focused on here at Clemson is the part that you may have heard about a little more in the news, which is social media disinformation. So these two images here are related to one another. The one in the upper left, that squat Cold War era cinder block building, was through 2016 the headquarters of the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. If you've ever read a story about the Internet Research Agency, you've probably seen that picture. It is an organization made famous again by the Mueller report that worked to influence real conversations, real users on social media and through other outlets here in the United States in the run-up to the 2016 election. Now, they actually got their start trying to influence their own people in Russia, and especially people on the border between Russia and the Ukraine. But starting in late 2014, early 2015, they used what they learned targeting their own people and started targeting Americans on social media. That building in the lower left, or in the lower right, however, is the newer Internet Research Agency building. That's the building they moved into just down the street from the old building in 2016 after the election. After the election, they got additional resources, could afford a fancier building. It's a nice part of town. I went and checked it out on Google Maps. It's right across the street from a Volvo dealership, and it has room to expand. And expand they have, and not just the Russians, but other organizations around the globe as well, working to do this same type of work. Their job is not as easy as it was in 2016. In 2016, they were paying for Facebook ads with rubles. That's not a joke. They were actually paying for Facebook ads in rubles, and registering for social media accounts with Russian phone numbers. They can't get away with that sort of thing anymore. But even though their life is more difficult, they certainly have more resources than they did before. They have the ability to be more creative and still have an impact on real conversations and real political discourse, real cultural discourse as well, here in the United States and throughout the West. So my colleague Patrick Warner and I, in around Christmas time of 2017, this idea that the Russians were operating fake social media accounts was just coming to light, and people were just talking about it. And Twitter gave to the House Intelligence Committee a list of a little over 3,000 Twitter accounts that they said were operated by the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. They didn't give the House Intelligence Committee the actual data that went with those accounts, the actual, here's what they were talking about. They didn't give them the tweets, and they didn't make any of those tweets public, just the names of the accounts. But fortunately, here at Clemson, we had access to a platform called Social Studio, which is owned by the company Salesforce. It's a platform that's mostly used for marketing and PR purposes. But we were able to use it in ways that it wasn't honestly really designed for, and in ways that they've changed the way the platform can be used since we used it in this way. But we used it to get deleted tweets from suspended accounts. And over the course of several months, we were able to download 3 million tweets from IRA accounts. Now, it's what we learned from those accounts that I want to talk about this evening, and what the IRA was doing on social media in the run-up and just following the 2016 election. And then after that, I want to touch a little bit on what different nation states are doing today. So I read, after we downloaded those 3 million tweets, I read Russian tweets until my eyes bled. I spent many weekends away from my family just going through those accounts, trying to get as in-depth a qualitative understanding of what it is they were doing as I could before we released those accounts publicly. And we did that in July of 2017 through or actually early August of 2017, through 538.com. That's Nate Silver's website. And they did a wonderful piece where they did some additional data analytics, did some visualization for us, which is what you see on the screen here. Because what we did is we put all of those tweets into categories. And there were 3 million tweets altogether that were from between 2015 and 2018. And about 2 million of those were in English. Many of the rest were in Russian. There were many more from before 2015 that we didn't access that were far disproportionately in Russian. Nearly 6 million more that Twitter later released that were in Russian. And then a large number in German, Italian. Our release of data actually resulted in a federal investigation in Italy based off of the tweets that we released, because there were a number in French and Spanish, and some tweets in Arabic as well. But about 2 million altogether were in English. So the IRA wasn't just working to influence conversations here in the United States. They were working to influence conversations across the West and pretty much any NATO ally. So being a native English speaker and not being even particularly good at speaking English, we focused on those English language accounts. And we clustered them into 4 types, 4 distinct things that we saw that the Russians were doing in the run-up to and just after the 2016 election. And those are the 4 images you see in front of you right now. We identified left trolls, which were predominantly purporting to be left-leaning Americans. Right trolls, which were purporting to be right-leaning Americans, predominantly supporting Donald Trump before and after the election. News feed accounts, which pretended to be local news aggregators. And I'm going to talk more about each of these in a little bit more detail. And then hashtag gamers, which I'll describe in more detail in a minute. They're a little more complicated in exactly what they were trying to get away with. But you can see that they all operated at different times. They spiked at different moments. The news feeds kind of operated almost in a bot-like fashion, just at a constant level. The hashtag gamers were a little more spiky. They focused around particular events. And then, as you can tell with the left trolls and the right trolls, they operate at a relatively low level. And the spike you see there on the left trolls is October 6th of 2016, a month before the election, the day before the Podesta email releases, the day before the famous video of Donald Trump on the bus, and perhaps purposely placed to help pump up the release of the Podesta emails the next day. So let me get into some detail about each of these different categories of things that the Russians were doing. The first is these newsfeed accounts. They, like I said, they pretended to be genuine news aggregators, and that's all they really did. They took legitimate news sources, RSS feeds, and other Twitter accounts from legitimate local news sources, and they told their followers that local news, often with a link to the legitimate news source, and typically using hashtags that would get people's attention. They looked very professional, as you can see with Pittsburgh Today. Pittsburgh Today there on the right is an example of what many of these accounts look like. What we discovered they were doing with a lot of further analysis that's actually still under peer review was they weren't just repeating local news. They were hand-picking the local news. For a long time, it was fairly even-handed repeating of the local news. But then in the months before the election, they really focused on, once they built up a following, around October 6th, they they started doing what they were designed to do, and that is to handpick local news. And they repeated local news that was particularly divisive, local news that talked about crime, local news that would make people frightened, local news that was about racial discrimination, racial violence. That's why we include this screen capture of Cleveland Today there on the left. If you see the top pinned tweet there is about Tamir Rice. That was what they really started to focus on was stories just like that in the run-up in the month before the election. Now, it's true that real local news focuses on those sorts of stories as well. That's oftentimes how you get viewers and how you get readers, but they did it disproportionate relative to the local news aggregators that they were pulling their content from.
Darren, can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure, absolutely.
So first of all, just to be clear, are both of the screen captures that you have here, Cleveland Today and Pittsburgh Today, are they both fake accounts?
Yes, those are both fake accounts run by the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. All of the images I'll be showing this evening are of fake local,
fantastic,
fake accounts from the IRA. We were able to get these off of various websites that store old web content. If you dig, you'd be surprised what you can find that's still lying about from the IRA. You just have to know what stones to look underneath.
Great, thank you.
But I still am impressed by just how professional some of these pages looked. Cleveland Today isn't the full page. Obviously, there's some imagery missing from that page. The site we got it from didn't store all of the information. Pittsburgh Today there is much more complete. I wanted to include Cleveland Today because it has that Tamir Rice pinned tweet. But Pittsburgh Today, it just looks really professionally done. And it's a good reminder that the Internet Research Agency was basically a marketing company. They had an art department, and they had a team of people monitoring their Google Analytics and monitoring the effectiveness of what it was they were doing and running tests to improve their work throughout their period, and even through to today. So next, that brings us to the hashtag gamers. To remind you, just to go back a minute, they're the ones in the lower right here that are more spiky. What the hashtag gamers were doing was literally playing a game called the hashtag game. The hashtag game is a game that still takes place on Twitter routinely today. It's a game that's run by a number of different legitimate sources. Comedy Central, I believe, runs a regular, or used to run a regular hashtag game. It's where you take a hashtag and these are games that take place at designated times. You put out a tweet, say, hey, I'm going to run a hashtag game at 8:00 on Tuesday. And you put out a hashtag to the group that's gathered on Twitter to play the game, and people start riffing on that hashtag and making jokes about it. So, many of the hashtags would be totally innocuous and innocent. But the Internet Research Agency accounts like Giselle Evans here, who's one of their most, you don't see her total number of followers that she eventually had in that screen grab, but she eventually got quite popular. They would tend to use hashtags that might be a little more divisive, a little more, questionable. Things that would be politically charged, things like better debate topics was one they tweeted about the debates, or, things I don't want Clinton to say. And then people would make jokes about that hashtag, and whoever got the most retweets and likes would win the game. That's how the hashtag game works. The reason they did it, it seems, would be to try to get particular hashtags to trend, particular jokes to take off and become popular. And one reason we believe they did this was because hashtag games are particularly popular around events like this evening around the debates. I guarantee you that there will be hashtag games played this evening, because that's how many people experience events like the debate. So when my wife and I watch Clemson football, for instance, she's typically only half watching the game. Sometimes I'm only half watching the game myself, but she's also experiencing the game through Twitter. She will follow the conversations on Twitter and comments, jokes, analysis that people on social media are making about the live event. And the Russians know that's how people here in the United States experience social media. And they were trying to take advantage of that with the hashtag gamers. And so it's interesting. They actually ran what seemed to be a test in 2016 around the 3 presidential debates. On one debate, they ran their hashtag gamers before the debate. On another debate, they had all their hashtag gamers playing the game during the debate. And with the other debate, they had all their hashtag gamers playing the game after the debate. We think that seems likely they were testing, which was most effective before, during, or after in spreading the messages and getting the engagement that they wanted. The frightening thing, obviously, being that, they know the answer to the question for tonight's debate.
Darren, quick question. This comes from Mike, who noticed as well that several of your examples so far have included the location Pittsburgh, USA, or Pittsburgh, US. Is that a coincidence? Did you just happen to bring 2 with Pittsburgh, or is that part of Pennsylvania particularly was it particularly targeted because of the role of Pennsylvania as a swing state?
Both are true. I did not purposely include 2 things from Pennsylvania, but it was more likely by chance because the IRA did seem to target Pennsylvania more often, and other swing states, Ohio, Nevada, just as they continue to do. Again, today I've seen a number of accounts lately that have an affiliation with a swing state. So
Great.
That gets us to the heart, really, of what the IRA was doing in 2016. And that was the right trolls and the left trolls. The right trolls being accounts that purported to be MAGA Americans, supporters of President Trump. These accounts, weren't middle of the road supporters of the president. They were accounts that were more extreme. They were tended to quite frequently be racist, nationalistic, anti-immigrant, but seemed to predominantly be trying to coalesce support, nonetheless, for the president and make other extreme voices on the right more predominant and more central to the conversation on Twitter. They sell the ideology in the same way that Budweiser sells beer, through the faces of attractive women, as you see with American Gunslinger there, with imagery of veterans, as you see with that post that they made on the right. But they tried a variety of different tactics. One of their most effective accounts was 10GOP. There's a number of articles, if you search on Google for 10GOP, about this account. It was frequently mentioned in the media when nobody knew that it was actually run by the Russians. We did a search for how many times people engaged with it in the month before the election, and it was over 150,000 individual engagements with this one account. It was pretending to be the unofficial voice of the Tennessee GOP. And if you think about just, what a small investment this was for Russia to create this account, and it did not take but 6 months or so to get it up to 150,000 followers. And what a small investment that is to then influence so many real Americans in the month before the election really suggests how why it is that they engage in this kind of work. Russia has an economy the size of Texas. They're not going to compete with us. But, all of the work of the IRA in the run before the election can be cost only a couple of tens of millions, whereas, an F-16 soup to nuts costs about $350 million. So that's a pretty small investment for a pretty large return. And we're still paying for it. Even if you just look at the effort that our government works to try to fight disinformation like this. I've worked closely with several different federal agencies, including Army Cyber Command, and they put serious resources into trying to stop accounts just like this, which are incredibly cheap to produce and to put out into the world. It is it's disproportionate. But just as they were operating accounts on the right, they were also operating accounts on the left, speaking to left-leaning Americans. Many, but not all of these accounts engaged in the Black Lives Matter community. A large number of them pretended to be Black women, like Polite Melanie and Tyra Jackson here. Now, these two particular accounts weren't on the official Twitter list. These weren't active in the run-up to the 2016 election or just after, though accounts exactly like them were. These two accounts we were able to identify here at Clemson as IRA accounts. We used that understanding we built over many months, that qualitative understanding of the particular techniques, the particular tactics, a number of particular technical signals that the IRA used in order to identify ongoing work. And Polite Melanie there was active just before the midterm elections, operating within the Black Lives Matter community. She was building a brand. Because you got to remember what the IRA does. It's not Boris and Natasha. It's not spycraft. It's marketing, and they're very good at it. You can almost see the moment in 2015 when you look at how they were operating. You can see the moment that they brought in consultants and shifted from trying to be Boris and Natasha to really just being a grassroots marketing organization. And that's what Melanie was doing. She, had a lot of very successful tweets, some tweets that gained her tens of thousands of retweets and likes. One of her tweets became a Scary Mommy blog post. She, in October of 2018, won the Chicago Tribune's Tweet of the Week contest, which I'm sure made many folks in St. Petersburg quite proud. That was an honor voted on by the readers of the Chicago Tribune. The exact tweet that won her that acclaim was making fun of Trump in a book is unfair. It's like making fun of the Amish on television. That's, of course, content that she actually stole from someone else. The Russians didn't come up with that tweet. But she was happy to take credit for it. And it was content like that got her many followers. And in only about 3.5 months, she was up to 20,000 followers.
And so it seems, as you describe that sort of it legitimizes the account and it amplifies when just sort of your common user of a social media platform goes in and sees that person has won an award from the Chicago Tribune, you're more likely to take it seriously.
Oh, absolutely. No question. I am sure that tweet alone gathered her, hundreds and hundreds of additional followers. And that sort of content is also important to in order to be a part of the particular community that they were pretending to be a part of. Many of their tweets were quite innocent. There's an example I have in the troll quiz that you were supplied before this evening, and I hope everyone had time to check that out. But in the additional content of the troll quiz, there's one tweet from a troll account that we identified as being operated by the Internet Research Agency that was just a video of a 2.5-year-old little boy on a bed. His dad throws him a soccer ball and he kicks the ball with a flying midair kick, and it's a beautiful kick. And that tweet was retweeted over 100,000 times and liked 400,000 times. Liked more than any other IRA tweet that's ever been identified. And that's, just absolutely remarkable. I would love that kind of engagement. I would love to put up the kind of numbers that the IRA is capable of doing. I've got about 1,200 followers, and I was pretty proud of that. Polite Melanie there got 20,000 followers in 3.5 months. Tyra Jackson is a 2019 era IRA account that we identified. And again, that's just an example of the sort of innocent content that they post in order to accrue followers and appear legitimate. Over 50,000 retweets, 250,000 likes. And while that is a lot, it was relatively routine throughout 2018 and 2019 for us to see IRA accounts that were putting up, low thousands of retweets, a couple tens of thousands of likes, on a weekly basis, easily. And it's worth pointing out that it obviously wasn't just on Twitter that the IRA was operating throughout 2016 and beyond. This is a screen capture of Black Matters US's website. Black Matters US was a Black Lives Matter organization that was created and maintained by the IRA, by the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. It was a complete soup to nuts organization. They had Facebook, Instagram, and it's worth pointing out that in general, the IRA got most of its engagement from Instagram. There hasn't been as much analysis of that because Facebook tends to be a closed organization in a lot of ways. I've been privileged enough to be a technical advisor from the Senate Intelligence Committee, so we've gotten access to all of that data from 2016 and 17 from Facebook and Instagram. I can't talk about specifics because of various NDAs that I've had to sign, but I can tell you that their engagement on Instagram consistently blew their engagement on Twitter out of the water. The Black Matters US was one of the more successful Black Lives Matter organizations that existed in 2016 and early 2017. It had a podcast. It had a newsletter. As you can see, it had a place you could donate to them. They had real events in the United States where they hired folks to put on protests. They put on an event right here in my home state of South Carolina, down in Charleston. And the amount of engagement that they got was frightening. But Black Matters US wasn't the only organization like this that they ran. There was another anti-police violence organization called Don'tShoot.us that they organized and ran. They had accounts on Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, even on Pokemon Go briefly. And they ran a variety of different blogs as well for some of their accounts. They had one account, Jen Abrams, which was a right-leaning account that had a very successful website in addition to her regular content. And then obviously they engage on some of the more non-traditional extreme platforms like 4chan and Gab. So as I indicated earlier, that the IRA is still active. We used what we learned about what they were doing in 2016. Yeah, sorry, I say IRA, but I do mean when I say IRA, the Russian IRA, the Russian Internet Research Agency, not the Irish Republican Army. And we took what we learned qualitatively and start to build tools to identify what they were doing in an ongoing way. At first, we were able to just really follow what they were doing within the Black Lives Matter community. And as we expanded our capacity, we started to be able to identify accounts that were operating in 2019 and early 2020 from across the political spectrum. Accounts that were, again, operating within MAGA communities, Trump supporters, accounts that were purporting to be part of the LGBTQ community, accounts that were purporting to be Latino Americans, and then some rather generic progressive accounts as well as accounts like David Lang there, who pretended to be a white Southern heritage supporter. And fundamentally, these accounts all followed the exact same playbook that the IRA was running throughout 2016. They worked to coalesce support around Donald Trump and on the right, and these accounts we were following during the primaries, and they largely worked to support Bernie Sanders on the left and to attack Joe Biden or whatever more moderate candidate was ahead at any given moment. So they were, for instance, very much against Buttigieg for a couple of weeks before they shifted back to attacking Joe Biden. But they use just a variety of tricks. Some of these accounts here, for instance, have faces that are computer generated. David Lang there is computer generated. Harmony Anderson is computer generated. That Gonzalez, she's computer generated. Other profile images are art that they stole from someplace on the internet. You can't disprove that somebody isn't who they are if they just have, a cartoon face. And then they also steal images and alter them in one way or another, like Princess Latifah there, altered them in ways like changing the color, flipping the image, so you can't do a simple reverse image search to figure out who that image is actually of.
Professor, I wonder if you can share a little bit more about this idea of artificially creating images. That's a pretty powerful thing to be able to do, particularly as you are computer generating an image, a face, some kind of representation that you think will speak to things. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process?
Sure. It's a technique that more and more disinformation operations have started to use, especially the Russians. It's called a GAN image. Now that I'm on the spot, I don't remember what GAN
That's okay.
stands for. I would love it if somebody Googled that and threw it up in the audience chat. But it's a computer program. There's several of them. You can find them that are free online. You can go generate an image of someone that doesn't exist in just a couple of minutes if you try hard enough. And they basically take real images and turn a number of real images into a composite. We've actually found a few of the images that Harmony is based off of. There are a few things about these GAN images, though, that don't always look quite right. And if you know what to look for, they're identifiable, especially when once you realize, is this a fake account? the fact that it's a GAN image tends to jump out. Like, just as an example, you'll notice that the eyes on Carrie Ash, David Lang, Zach Gonzalez, and Hermine Edwards are all smack dab in the middle of that image. That's because that's where the computer put them. You also notice that all of those images, the background is a bit blurry. It's because the computer program that builds these faces is built to build faces. Computers just do what you tell them. So if you tell a computer to build a face, it's not going to be very good at building backgrounds unless you then teach it to build backgrounds. And that's a whole other ball of wax. And so far, most of these platforms are just built to build faces. So they make a great face, great shadowing, looks totally believable. All these folks have great hair. But it's funny, we found another account that when you put up I should have included it, and next time I give a presentation like this, I will. But there's another right-leaning white male account that we found that the Russians were running that the GAN image looked frighteningly like David Lang. It was like I had to do a number of searches to figure out if it was actually two images of the same person. But no, we just came down and decided later that it was just two GAN images that perhaps use some of the same composites. Because, computers are limited in what they can do still. I am not honestly as afraid of this idea of deep fakes as some people are. A spicy meme is powerful enough. And deep fakes tend to be discreditable in the end, just like these GAN faces are discreditable in the end. It's just as easy to use a cartoon face or a real image that you've found somewhere else and altered in one way or another. The GAN images are just they at the end of the day they're a little boring too compared to some of the other images that they use. So while they have the same strategy as they did in 2016 to push us to extremes and to attack the middle and to make other individuals more central to the conversation, which is an important thing to point out. In fact, let me go back just real quick to this image. And if you see the heightened volume after the big blue spike, and there's heightened volume in the right trolls after a similar spike in the same period in the month before the election and following. What's interesting about that spike is before that spike, they were doing a lot of original tweets and replies to other users. Content that takes time to do, and the type of content that accrues followers and accrues meaningful engagement. But that spike and after, they switched. They totally changed their tactics. And they switched from, 60, 70% original tweets and 15% retweets to 90% retweets after that spike. And what they were doing was, we realized, was what they had to say wasn't as important. What was important was what real people had to say and making those people more central to the conversation and introducing those people to one another. We did a study where we, thanks for finding the GAN image test, Ginger. So what we found was people that engaged with Russian trolls in that month before the 2016 election were more likely to retweet in the week following that engagement and more likely to pick up additional followers in the week following that engagement than in the week before that engagement. And that's scary in a couple ways. It makes sense to us. It's what we were expecting to find because that's the way social media works. We like that dopamine hit. That's why we go back to social media so often. We like that engagement. We like the validation that comes with hearing from others. And also the way Twitter works, like if you're away from the platform and somebody engages with your content, you get that reminder from Twitter to come back. Your phone dings, and you want to go back and check why it dinged. And so it made sense to us that people got more engagement and they got more followers, but it scared us because we realized that effect that the IRA had in 2016 of giving those accounts more followers, that effect lingers. Those accounts still have those additional followers today. And according to our analysis, that effect in terms of just the raw number of retweets generated and the additional followers created was very likely a much larger effect than any direct effect that the IRA had. And it also speaks to the idea that, we'll never truly know what effect the IRA had on the 2016 election or what effect they may have on the 2020 election, because there's no test and control study that you can run on an election. You can't take them out of the scenario and run the election again. And it's very, very difficult to evaluate, second and third order effects like an account gaining more followers and being more engaged because it engaged with an IRA troll. It makes my head spin sometimes and makes me want to stop looking and go take a nap. So while their strategy has been the same recently in the accounts that we've identified, their tactics have changed. As I suggested, they aren't paying for Facebook ads with rubles anymore, and they aren't registering their accounts with Russian phone numbers. But there's more subtle changes as well. They're not tightly networked together like they used to be. Back in 2016, all of these accounts were tightly networked together, and they worked as a team, and they helped boost each other's messages, and they helped each other gain additional followers. And today, these accounts that we identified, they don't follow each other at all. And we think that might largely be because they, in 2016, once Twitter identified a piece of the network, you pull one thread and the whole thing falls apart. You pull apart the entire sweater. And so they've diversified today. They've made their accounts in relative terms smaller. In the past, in 2016, they ran a number of big accounts, and they used smaller accounts to amplify those bigger accounts. Whereas today, my colleague Patrick has said it well. They want to be influential but not memorable. So they're more likely to run accounts with a few thousand followers rather than a few tens of thousands of followers. And trust me, it's not because they couldn't get more followers. They are better at social media than any of us are. Like I said, they're professionals. But they diversified in other ways as well. Last summer, we here at Clemson, we identified a number of accounts that self-identified as being in Accra, Ghana. But when I looked at those accounts, and these were all accounts that were purporting to be West Africans, but really were mostly engaging in conversations here in the U.S. in very organic and very sophisticated ways. And when I looked at those accounts, I just thought, wow, somebody in St. Petersburg trained whoever's running these accounts to do what they're doing. And so I followed those accounts. It was a rather large cluster, about a dozen or so accounts. And they were active on other platforms as well as Twitter. Shared those accounts with some folks in the government, and a producer from CNN was visiting us, and I shared those accounts with him as well in about November of that year. And this is after I'd actually worked with Twitter to suspend the first wave of these accounts, and they just created a second wave that looked very much like the first wave, but stopped self-identifying as being from West Africa. And so I told CNN about it, and for some reason, I thought that they would think I was crazy when I said, hey, I think the Internet Research Agency from St. Petersburg is running a troll farm in West Africa. For some reason, they believed me. And a couple months later, they were in West Africa. Clarissa Ward and her team, Clarissa Ward, she's the chief foreign correspondent for CNN, just a remarkable human being. It's always fun to work with somebody who's at the top of their field and someone as talented as Clarissa. And her team just did a fantastic job. They were able to go to West Africa, identify the troll farm, which by that time had actually been shut down by Ghanaian authorities. As I mentioned, it wasn't just CNN that I gave these accounts to, but they were able to identify the group trying to reform, interview the person that was in charge of it. They dug to the point where they were able to confirm that the organization was being funded by the Internet Research Agency, by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the owner of the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. He's a Putin flunky. And the individual who was running that operation was indicted by the Ghanaian authorities. And just actually 2 weeks ago, a Russian who was part of that operation was indicted by our own U.S. authorities on money laundering charges. So same strategy, different tactics, because they have to. They've got they have more resources, and so they're going to use them. But they're also putting those resources in places that maybe we're not looking as carefully, like West Africa. It's really, really important to point out before we finish up that this isn't just Russia. I've talked a lot about Russia today, and I know a lot of people are tired of talking about Russia. Sometimes I'm tired of talking about Russia, which is why I want to say it's not just Russia. A lot of other countries and other domestic organizations have learned from what the Russians are doing and are applying some of the same techniques. The Chinese, for instance, what they do is very different than what the Russians do. The Chinese tend to, I like to say that the Chinese care what you think about China, and Russia cares about what you think about your neighbor. The Russians tend to be a little more offensive. The Chinese are more defensive in their disinformation techniques. But just like Russia, they have state media that they try to disseminate in the United States, and they also run fake Twitter accounts and fake Instagram accounts and fake Facebook accounts. Mostly just repeating state lines or attacking people that disagree with them publicly. We worked with the Wall Street Journal about a year ago now, last October, to analyze Daryl Morey, tweets attacking Daryl Morey. Daryl Morey was general manager of the Houston Rockets, and NBA has deep ties in China, like a lot of other U.S. corporations. And Daryl Morey said something positive about democracy in Hong Kong and something supportive. He had the audacity to say something supportive of the protesters there fighting for democracy in Hong Kong. And over the course of the week following his tweet, which he was forced to take down, in the course of the week following that tweet, 1,000 new accounts were created every day. And the first thing each of those accounts did was tweet something nasty at Daryl Morey, usually about his mom. I won't repeat any of those messages, but you can imagine what they were. And most of them had pretty, not only bad words, but also just bad English, because it was very, very likely a Chinese operation, or at least an operation supported by the Chinese government. So the Chinese engage in some of these same tactics, as do the Iranians. All of these nation states have different goals. There's some suggestion that Iran, for instance, would prefer Donald Trump not be the next president of the United States, whereas the Russians very likely do prefer Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States. But the Iranians don't have the capacity that the Russians do. I can tell you that they've done some good work. By good work, I don't mean good work. I mean bad work, but some quality work. But it's not the same quality as the Russians. The Russian accounts engage in the communities that they engage in fluid and sophisticated ways. They give their staff lessons. They take classes. A lot of the team members that work for the IRA have traveled in the U.S. They've studied in the U.S. They know us well, and that seems to be less likely in Iran. But they still do try to engage in some of the same communities that the Russians do. Just as an example, I have this. This is a website created by the Iranian government. It is obviously reminiscent of Black Matter's U.S. Doesn't look quite as good, but it's trying to reach the same audience and to some of the same ends, to influence those particular communities to think and believe in the ways that the Iranian government would prefer them to think and believe, and to either raise or lower voter turnout depending on the day of the week and the whims of the particular nation state. So I do want to stop, and that's all for my official presentation, but I want to give plenty of time for whatever questions y'all might have.
Fantastic. Thank you for doing that. And we do have quite a few questions that have queued up in the Ask Professor Linville box, and I'm going to bring them to you in a little bit out of order. But I wonder if we can start with Jennifer Stockdale's question, who asks, are there individuals or groups or communities in the United States who use these same tactics and strategies against other nations? Do we do this too?
Not to my knowledge in the same way. And it's a sort of operation that takes a lot of human capital. I know that the U.S. government does run some troll, some people call them sock puppet, but sock puppet or troll accounts. But it's usually for very specific ends, like trying to infiltrate a particular extremist group. I know they've done it a lot in trying to stop extremist recruitment, for instance, in particular terrorist organizations. So you set up an account that pretends to, have a particular leaning that is parallel to that terrorist organization and become part of that organization. I know that sort of thing is done by national security teams. But the sort of public influence accounts, I don't know that they do. We have obviously other methods. The only, for instance, something I'm actually quite proud of, the only, sorry, I've been talking for an hour and a half and my mind is blanking. The Islamic minority group in China, help me with the word, that China is working to suppress. Somebody out there must know the word I'm looking for. It
must be fun to talk to 200 people and not have anybody throw you a lifeline.
Yeah, exactly. Come on. Yes, thank you, Allison, my hero, Allison Hogarth. I will send you flowers, and Katie. But the Uyghurs, now they come flooding in. Yes, the Uyghurs. The only Uyghur language radio station in the world is run by the U.S. government, is run by the State Department. And so, yes, the United States does run influence campaigns. I mean, for God's sake, you can consider all of Hollywood an influence campaign. But to my knowledge, most of the influence campaigns at scale that we run are honest about who and what they are. And I think that's an incredibly important difference for an open democracy. We can spread our message in an open way. And it would also be much, much more difficult for us to spread our message in some of these countries that are doing it to us, because China has their own social media platforms, as does Iran and Russia, that they monitor very closely. So it's a very different thing, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate that fact. That this is the scales aren't equal here. They can attack us on Western platforms, and we can't necessarily shoot back in the same way.
As you can imagine, there are a lot of questions around what do we do? How do we counteract this, whether it's by personal choice, whether it's by legislation, whether it's by avoidance, or certainly as educators. But I want to ask that full question, that cumulative question, by also asking you to speak about the notion of free speech on social media and whether or not America, because of the nature of our open society, is more susceptible in some ways to these kinds of strategies and campaigns, and what can we do about it if we are?
Yeah, there is no question we're more susceptible to these sort of campaigns, almost uniquely susceptible because of how ubiquitous social media is in the United States. If it was up to me, we would burn down the platforms. But I think that horse is out of the barn.
So wait, just actually, that's a pretty powerful thing to say, and I know.
Oh, I'm speaking flippantly, and I don't necessarily mean it. Social media has a lot of value as well, right. In helping people be civically engaged, and helping people reach one another in ways that weren't possible before. And certainly, we saw the power of social media as recently as the Arab Spring. A lot of that uprising, though some of it may not have turned out as well as we would have liked. At least in Tunisia, for instance, it's been generally a success, and a lot of that is due to social media. So it's a double-edged sword. I certainly wish the platforms would be doing more than they are. I often feel that they do exactly as little as they can get away with and appear to be addressing the issue. I think that's especially true with Facebook and Instagram. Twitter doesn't have the resources that Facebook does, but they are at least more willing to work with other outside groups like myself than Facebook and Instagram is. In small ways, Facebook is opening up, but it's not in a meaningful way yet. I think, though, that at the end of the day, because we can't rely on the platforms to solve these problems, we do need to take some personal responsibility. I am going to buy a safe car. I'm going to wear my safety belt, and I hope that whoever builds my car builds a heck of an airbag, and builds it in such a way that I'm going to be protected, but I'm still going to be a safe driver when I'm on the road. I absolutely think you can't take personal responsibility out of this, and be a critical consumer and critical of the accounts that you engage with. But even that is, I sometimes hesitate to advocate for, because even that is a double-edged sword because of the way in which we are all critical of one another now on social media. It's an easy ad hominem attack to say, oh, I disagree with you, not because we have different lived experiences and we happen to disagree on this point, but I can disagree with you because you aren't even a real person, even though it's almost always a real person. I can't tell you how many people send me social media accounts and say, hey, is this a Russian troll? And it's never a Russian troll. It's almost always a real person.
Do you have suggestions on how to do that. So Raina, who is with us for many of our webinars, it's always good to have Raina with us, gave you a compliment in his question. And the compliment was, wow, that can you spot the troll quiz is really hard and misleading. So when you take it, so as educators, and all these folks are going to be standing with and around and in front of or on the other side of screens from younger people, what kinds of actual tactics or strategies might they employ to be able to be more of a critical consumer?
Sure. I honestly think it's simpler than people realize. I honestly think it comes down to realizing that the rules for life in social media are not any different than the rules for life in the real world. In the real world, it is true that most strangers aren't going to hurt you. Most strangers are perfectly nice, and there are a lot of important reasons to maintain anonymity in the real world and on social media. But we still have to take the fact that someone is a stranger into account when we engage with them in the real world and on social media. When I was a little boy, growing up in the 80s, my mother wouldn't let me walk just a few blocks to school because, like a lot of moms in the 80s, she thought I was going to be abducted by a man in a white van giving me free candy. So instead, I had to sit for an hour at a time on the bus rather than walking just a few blocks to my elementary school. And that same generation is now so free to give up that same sense of protectiveness when they engage online. Baby boomers are between 7 and 8 times more likely to spread fake news than my students' generation is. And I fear that is probably doubly true with fake accounts like what I've talked about this evening. It's also really important to point out that these fake accounts, they're not spreading fake information. Almost always the information they give is true, but it's given with spin. They tell you how to think about issues, and they try to pull people in a direction they were already inclined to go, in a slightly more extreme direction, and entrenching people in their beliefs.
Jeremy asks, and now I'm going to sort of flip that away from prevention to more about the outcomes. Jeremy asks, what are the sort of overall goals of these fake accounts? Is it simply civil confusion and disarray? Is it to change the ways in which we think about and speak about particularly important and sometimes divisive topics? What exactly are they attempting to do? And then as a corollary question, I'm also going to tag on Teresa's question, which is, do other organizations in this country knowingly maybe pull on the coattails of that and amplify their own message? Her example is QAnon or other organizations who see that happening and decide to take advantage of the breach that it's caused.
Sure. Well, first of all, what their goals are totally depends on the organization we'll start with nation states. Like I said, when I was talking about China, their goal seems to mostly be about face saving. China doesn't allow their own people onto Western social media platforms, though oftentimes, individual Chinese will jump the firewall, so to speak. But in general, there are not many people in China on Western platforms. And so if China wants its voice to be represented, its perspective to be represented on Western platforms, it oftentimes has to create it itself. And so if you go look at the Twitter account of any Chinese consulate or embassy in the US, it'll take you about a minute and a half to find a fake account that is almost surely operated, either paid for by the Chinese government or operated by the Chinese government itself. And so that's not necessarily to change anyone's mind or to because they want to persuade anyone. It's because they want to make it look like people are retweeting their embassies and consulates. It seems to largely just be about perceptions. It's just marketing 101. If you want to be legitimate, you have to appear legitimate. Dress for the job that you want, not the job that you have. Whereas with the Russians, it seems to be much more about division, about confusion, but also, and I think not enough people talk about this, about distraction. The more we're talking about what's happening on the streets of Kenosha, we're not talking about what's happening in the Ukraine. We're not talking about the fact that Putin just poisoned his biggest domestic adversary. And that is definitely in Putin's best interest. And so they work very hard to make sure that we are focused on domestic issues and what's happening on the streets of Kenosha or Seattle or wherever else, and fighting amongst ourselves. And that weakens NATO and gives Putin more of a free hand.
Of course, tonight is the first presidential debate of 2020. Mike asks and notes that this is a very scary, it's a very disturbing topic. It's eye-opening. We've had this hostile foreign power sort of undermining our democracy for at least the last 4 or 5 years. We've had 4 years to prepare for this particular election. Can you tell us what we've done about this? What kinds of steps have we taken to try to prevent the same thing from happening?
There have been, some very specific actions. So like that glass building I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, on the day of the 2018 midterm election, Army Cyber Command carried out a cyber attack on that building, shut it down so that there was no internet coming in or out of that building. So today their operations, they still have, from what I understand, their human resources and those kind of folks are in that building, but their actual operational teams, the folks that actually run the platforms, are no longer in that building. They've been scattered to the winds across St. Petersburg. So we've done that sort of thing, very direct attacks. We've shut down accounts in an ongoing way. Just 2 weeks ago, Twitter and Facebook, operating on a tip from the FBI, shut down a number of IRA accounts that were operating a program that was using American journalists to write articles that were then disseminated through social media and blogs by the IRA. Academics like ourselves and others have identified a limited amount of content and worked with the platforms and others to suspend those accounts. So there is work being done by a lot of hardworking folks in and out of the government. The platforms, as critical as I am of them, they are taking it more seriously. Certainly, I mean, they couldn't have taken it less seriously than they did in 2016. But they are, monitoring and shutting things down when it's brought to their attention. But it's, we're also doing more of this ourselves. COVID-19 has made things much worse because more people are on social media now than ever before because they're home and they're bored and spreading all kinds of misinformation as well as disinformation.
Lori asks for a little bit of a clarification on the freedom of speech amendment. To your knowledge, are other governments, are foreign entities protected from by that amendment as well? If we know that there are foreign sources doing this, are they protected in what they do, or is this is outside of our domestic legal domain? Correct.
We, especially when it comes to the reason for all of the indictments against the Russian government is because, or against employees of the IRA who are, loosely affiliated with or not so loosely affiliated with the Russian government. that is because specifically they were working to influence the U.S. elections. And that gives you a pretty wide bandwidth. It's also worth pointing out that, a lot of what we're talking about is not actually the First Amendment. The First Amendment gives you freedom of speech, but it doesn't give you freedom of platform. We're much more often talking about the platform rules. Their terms of service are what dictate a lot of what can be done, not the First Amendment.
It seems, we've got so many educators in the room with us tonight. It seems, based on what you've shared, particularly in the last 15 or 20 minutes, that the lesson they put together, the activities they design, or the conversations they have might well be with the grandparents' generation more than their students themselves.
I have been saying that for a couple of years now, that we are teaching media literacy in the high schools. Even they are not enough. And we should be teaching it in retirement homes.
And that would be an interesting community service project for any of our teachers to design for their communities.
I could not agree more. In fact, I just did a presentation for a group of retirees 2 days ago.
Darren, I've got one last question for you before our time is out tonight. When you think about the ways that social media, again, is so incredibly intertwined with our culture and the ways we communicate, oftentimes in very positive ways, whether it's connecting with loved ones, whether it's having access to news that we may not see in a larger news service, having all of information at our fingertips through internet. As you imagine all of that, where's the cusp? Where does this go next in terms of not just our access, but us collectively, certainly led by teachers, but us realizing the sheer power underneath us, and that we rein it in, that we figure out a way to really put our hands around it. What's coming next?
I hope that we get some control of this over time, when more and more of the people engaging on social media are social media natives, digital natives, people accustomed to the sort of that are used to the lessons that I'm teaching my children years before I even allow them to have a social media account. Because it is true that some of the problem, though certainly not all of the problem, is a disproportionate amount of the problem is from Americans who, don't have the sort of grounding that I know that my children will have when they're finally allowed to be on social media. I also hope that change comes, if it doesn't come from top down, I hope it comes from the bottom up, from the consumer level, where we start to demand more change from the platforms. And, there are ways, because fundamentally, one of the biggest problems is anonymity, and that anonymity is the norm, and that it is in the platform's best interest to allow people to register cheaply and quickly for an account, because we are the thing being sold. And so they want it to be as fluid and easy as possible to allow ourselves to sell our attention to their clients. And that's the dynamic that needs to change, is the issue of anonymity. And there needs to be, and there are solutions to this, that would be a whole other presentation, but there are solutions to being able to prove at a minimum that you're a real human being.
That's a fantastic place to end. Darren Linville, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your expertise. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andy. This was fun.